I grew up in New York City. My family are Italian-American immigrants. So yeah, I grew up in a very very working class family, not very academic. They were very like hands-on, and you know, it was very far from what I'm doing right now and all of the context and, you know, where I wanted to be when I was really young. But yeah, it was very, I mean, I grew up in like the 80s, early 90s in New York City in America, which was a very special place at the time. And luckily, I was involved in art at quite a young age, and I was going already to private art schools and workshops, maybe 4 or 5 times a week since I was about 5 years old. My dad was very encouraging to put me in a place or put me in a position where I wasn't bored in school. I wasn't bored with what was the normal, I think, academic curriculum, because I really needed a lot of stimulation. But I was always going to private school since I was super young because, you know, I couldn't really afford to go to the art classes, things like that. So I got in for free, and I really had to bust my ass to maintain my grades to also be in these programs. Most of the people I went to the private art school with all came from a very different socioeconomic background. I was the only one that had, like, you know, maybe a one-parent household, and parents that didn't come from any sort of higher education. I mean, my parents only made it through high school. And all my other friends in the school, you know, their dad was the curator at Guggenheim and things like that, which was really exciting. But yeah, definitely we had a very different, you know, background, all my friends and I, and that became very apparent. The more I got involved in the arts, the more it became very clear that there were some class boundaries that I had to transcend. And it wasn't because of my parents or my family wanting me to kind of, you know, encourage me to be very curious and to kind of make something out of my artistic work or artistic thinking. It was more like I wanted to or needed to learn how to communicate through artistic works of art, and that was a big part of my training since I was 14, learning how to use art as a form of communication and understanding the socio-political background behind artistic movements and how artistic works also are reflected in what's happening politically, socially, and trying to learn and have a vocabulary to communicate what's happening also in my life. And I didn't really know at the time what they were preparing me for, but now in retrospect, I know that they were just training us to know how to be critical thinkers in artistic, well, in any artistic practice or any creative practice. So it's not like I wanted to be an artist, it was just the way that I was, like, you know, using my brain and using my mind, because I was, you know, I was going to art school since I was like 5 after school, you know, and they were really like putting pressure on me at such an early age. And it wasn't because I didn't want it, I was always like more, because I was getting so bored so easily. And I was very good at drawing, I was very good at, like, you know, doing anything that they put in front of me. And, you know, when I was 14, I ended up in the Cooper Union High School program, which was quite tough to get into. They put pressure on us. They were really like, that's shit, do it again. And they broke us down like, oh, you did that for homework, that's not good enough. You need to do it over and over and over again. So it was trying to make us understand how works of art also position themselves in the society and why that's so crucial for understanding and how kind of art helps us move forward. So it wasn't like I chose to be an artist, it was more about I always wanted to communicate something. And of course, many people don't know this, but I also was considering going into science because I was also a very good student when it came to science and biology, because I was always so curious about understanding how things relate to one another. But that's also, I think, being an artist is like understanding how things relate to one another and understanding how art is a very essential means of communication for society. So I never did not think about it. I knew that because of my background and because going to school in the United States is quite expensive, it's exorbitantly expensive, I didn't want to have student debt, you know, when I was 21 or 22, because I would never be able to afford an artistic practice like so many of my friends who had invisible sources of income via their parents or their families. I didn't have that luxury, and I knew I wanted to communicate something and kind of break away from this class-based system of making art. So I really needed to think pragmatically about how am I going to have an artistic career, you know, and make art and not kind of deal with like an overwhelming amount of student debt, which is what happens in America quite often. In the 90s, you know, Europe was going through a lot of political transformations, and you can totally see it in the art. So when I was like, you know, a teenager, we were, you know, in New York, we had like Jeff Koons, we had like the whole Made in Heaven series, we had, you know, Alex Katz, all this pop art, 'cause we were going through the 90s, you know, it's like Bill Clinton, everyone's on drugs, having a great time. And then you see what's going on in Europe, and it's like really intense politics, like Margaret Thatcher, you're dealing with like all of that aftermath, like unification in Germany, Cold War, and it was a totally different reality. So when I saw the artworks from Germany and post-socialist countries, you saw that it was a very different reality, and the artwork was just something I've never seen before. I was very robust, it was very rugged, it was super politically charged. I didn't see that before. So I started to just kind of read about it, because also when I was in Cooper Union at the high school program, we were reading about, you know, a lot of Marxist theory and what was happening in Europe at the time artistically, comparing that to what was happening in America. So, and I was like, oh, why do they have such a strong, very alternative, more experimental art forms rather than New York, which was, I think it still is, it's one of the biggest epicenters of contemporary art, you know? So I thought about that, and I was like, you know, maybe it would be a good opportunity to kind of go there for a bit. I ended up actually going to school in Poland, in Krakow. I finished my schooling, and then I made my way to Berlin, because, I mean, Berlin was kind of, you know, quite an alternative city. I had some friends that were here. I think things were quite cheap. It wasn't super commercial, you know, I mean, it's a long time ago. But yeah, so I was just very curious about what was happening here. So I kind of made my way over here more than 10 years ago, and that's how I kind of, yeah, that's the abridged version of how I ended up here. I would say when I moved here, I really didn't have so many expectations, but of course I wanted to be an artist, and I was looking to just kind of figure out ways to do that. But, you know, I was right out of school. I also didn't really know myself. So I still had a lot of growing up to do, and that never stops. It doesn't matter if you're like, you know, 35 or 38 or like 50. I mean, you keep growing all the time, because you are also experiencing things in real time. And at the time, you know, I was super young. I didn't have a lot of life experience. I mean, you can't make artwork unless you have like life experience. So I was, you know, just being very curious about Berlin and just kind of figuring out who I was, because I, you know, was just out of school. I had nothing, I had no experience in life. So I was just making a lot of friends and, you know, discovering new things, also kind of just figuring out who I was, and my work kind of grew from those experiences, mostly through my relationships, I would say, which, you know, you can't plan relationships, they just happen to you. You can never plan for that kind of stuff. I think there's quite a lot of space in terms of mental and physical space that you cannot afford in New York City, for example. And at least in my position at the moment, I do have much more flexibility than I had years ago. But, you know, I worked all the time. I worked all the time living here. It wasn't like I was partying or, you know, all those things that you do when you come here. You know, of course I did that, but in short amounts, because I wanted to be an artist. I didn't want to, you know, go to parties all the time. It's not my agenda, and it also doesn't interest me. It's like kind of boring actually, because I'm more interested in like being creative. And I didn't want that kind of stuff to take up space in my life. So, you know, that's like boring for me. I don't really care about that stuff. So I was more interested in like relationships and curious about politics. And, you know, what people are doing, how they're living here, how they're affected by the past, how they're affected by the future, and also how they're living in the present. My interest in that party stuff is like quite boring, you know, everybody falls into that. So I think for me, yeah, I just kind of moved here without any expectations, and I do feel I never compromised any of my artworks, let's just say it like that. And some of my artworks can be super political and they can be very confrontational, but never did I ever make any compromises or center myself artistically, because I don't believe in that. Living here has shaped and informed not just myself, but also my artistic practice. I could not kind of, at the time I didn't really understand, or I didn't know how to express myself or express those experiences, but I think the videos or the vocabulary that I've been developing effectively articulates my experiences of living in this city, which, you know, wherever you live, I mean, it's a place where you spend the most amount of time. Of course, you're going to be affected by the past and by history. It always will inform you and inform your artistic work. That's impossible. I mean, otherwise you'd be living in a basement, like making stuff out of your imagination. I mean, if you're putting yourself in an environment that has a very, you know, specific past. I mean, Berlin has a very specific past, and so does Germany. It will affect you to a degree or another. That's just inevitable. So of course that is always, you know, I've embraced that. As much as difficult as that can be sometimes, I've embraced it and can make work about it and can kind of transform those experiences into works of art, because that's what I was trained to do. I was trained to think critically about what is happening to me personally, how that's informed by the past, and how to make works of art that reflect on those experiences. Because the works of art are not about me. It's about something much bigger than you, than me. It's about living in a particular place and how experiences inform people and our relationships. So for me, that's how I've kind of been living and relating to Berlin. I think like anyone who comes from a multicultural background, because I was not born in New York City, I was born in South Korea, but you know, as I said, I'm American, and Americans are, let me just put it this way, I'm an American, but I'm also a female minority, and you know, I'm reminded of that every day in Germany. Might not be reminded of that in New York City. I'll be very honest about that. But I think in a place like New York City, because, you know, I spent most of my time there growing up, and it kind of informed what I know and what I'm conscious about. You know, it's impossible to not compare or be informed by your childhood and how you think about race, how you think about class, how you think about art, or, you know, all of the above, you know. I don't really think about, you know, oh, you know, it's better here. It's just a part of life. I mean, you know, my home is always going to be America. It's impossible to like deny that. I mean, it makes up a big part of my personality, and it's also a big part of my visual vocabulary and my artwork. You can totally tell I'm American in the art. I mean, that's impossible. It's just it's a huge trademark. So. I don't really think about it so much. I just kind of like go with the flow, I guess, especially when I'm making artwork. It's not, you know, I know how to use the vocabulary because it's inside of me. It's also something that, you know, I grew up with, so of course it's my vocabulary to a degree. Germany is a country with a lot of resistance, and I'm always attracted to places that have a lot of resistance, or there are places of protest. I've always been attracted to those places, you know, places that are very real, because I also come from that. You know, I don't come from, you know, a city that is completely pristine. I come from a city, and I come from a place where, you know, it's very real. It's very much informed by working class backgrounds and people's struggles and protests. So of course Berlin is a place of immense protests, and a city with a lot of different layers of history. But of course, you know, it comes at a price, because I do think there are times when you're reminded that you don't belong and you're never going to belong. It doesn't matter how good your German is, it doesn't matter all of the above. You will always be reminded you are not, you don't belong. Or you might be looked at as a novelty. You might be looked at as somebody that's different. And that's something that is hard to reckon with, but you know, I don't let it define me, because it's just not how I look at myself. But it does come out in the artworks, whether I like it or not, it always comes out in the artworks, and somehow I'm very conscious about it. In some ways I'm not. So I kind of deal with it in that way, but I try to make sense of those experiences always in the artworks, mostly in the videos, so I can kind of articulate those experiences and my thoughts about it, and understand the historical dynamics and the complexities of those experiences of not belonging in the artworks. That's always been something that I've been communicating, because it's not just me who experiences that. There's so many people that experience that on every level. So that's why I think it's important to communicate. And you know, artistic work is always about communication. And if that's not included in artistic works, and you're living in a city like Berlin, then that's a problem. That's a serious problem artistically. If that's not being represented, that means no one's paying attention to it. It also means no one's talking about it. But I know people are talking about it because I'm in that community. So there's a problem. So that's why I've always sought to make work that kind of deals with those kinds of marginalized topics. For me, artistic work isn't about pretty pictures, about being provocative. It's really about just communication. And of course, my personal life and how I experience the world is a big source of my artworks and the things that I'm kind of communicating, things I'm very interested in. So that's always been kind of the driving force of my work, I would say. I wouldn't have it any other way, I suppose. I mean, I know some people have a different artistic practice, like they're interested in science or they're interested in nature, the environment, but you know, it's like making food. You only want to, you know, you want to make what you want to eat. I don't want to make something that I don't want to eat. That's ridiculous. Nobody should do that. So it's like making work for me, it's like making food. You make what you kind of want to eat and that you're very passionate about. Otherwise, it's like a waste of time. What I can do is I can kind of learn how to sustain my artistic work by being very smart in how I generate income and how I save income and how I spend income. So it's a lifestyle choice and it's not easy. You have to do what works best for you, and you just have to hustle and you just have to be very smart, because I think, you know, I've always had faith in my practice. That's definitely true. And I think faith makes you do super creative things in terms of generating income. Faith and putting yourself in a corner, you'll always find creative ways to kind of, you know, get by. And if you have very good friends and you have, you know, really solid relationships, your friends will always help you. As well as I've always like kind of helped my friends, like faith makes you do creative things. So that's how I've always kind of survived, I guess. And luckily the last few years have been pretty good. But, you know, it's always like this all the time. You can never, you can't have your body in the same condition, you know, every day, all the time. It doesn't work like that. And, you know, it's a living organism. Your artistic practice is a living organism. It goes up and down all the time. Like relationships, you know, it's never going to be like this. It's always going to be like, you got to kind of, you know, understand how the journey and how it's going to go, how the trajectory is. So I have a Daueraufenthaltserlaubnis, so I have a permanent residency in Germany. But luckily I had enough anxiety from going to the Ausländerbehörde and, you know, dealing with that nonsense. So luckily I don't have to do that anymore. But I had to do it like every 2-3 years before that, and it was, you know, bureaucratic nightmare. Let's just say it was always like, whenever I had that appointment coming up, I just couldn't sleep. I was like, ugh, you know, a place you don't want to be, basically. I mean, it was my choice. I mean, I want to be here. I want to stay here, and I was willing to do what it took to make that happen. And it's also, again, as you said, it's a responsibility. If you're an artist, you have to be very responsible in every artistic decision that you make. And if you put an artwork out there that talks about this politicized subject, this racialized subject, then you have to be responsible and held accountable for every decision that you make. And I really believe that. And so if your work does not communicate or is not relating to the audience, then you fail as an artist. Then you got to learn from that failure. So it's about accountability and about responsibility. If you take on something, you have to go all the way, because if you want to do something, you have to understand the responsibilities and the things that you need to do to make that happen. That's a big part, I think, of what being an artist is responsibility for your audience. The audience has to be respected, and if you want to communicate something, you have to give the audience a full range of experiences and ideas so that they can think for themselves. You know, of course, I might not agree with the audience, but my job as an artist, and I think a big part of my responsibility, is giving them as much information as I can artistically to talk about this and this subject so that they can think about it for themselves, and they were communicated something that maybe they never thought about, and being confronted with something they never thought about. And it's, you know, it's not their reality, so it's not real for them, it's real for me. And I think that's a big part of the problem. What's real for me is not real for someone else. Therefore, it's not real. So I'm communicating something that they have to relate to. And I want to respect my audience's opinion, that it might not be mine, it might not be their reality, but they can maybe think about something in an alternative way. They can think about how to move forward. And, you know, everyone's busy. Nobody can kind of be doing this, doing that. So I think artistically, it's my responsibility to kind of put artworks or position artworks in the public space so that everybody can relate to it. Everyone can access that. It doesn't matter their socioeconomic background, doesn't matter if they have a background in academics, art, history, any of that kind of stuff. They can relate to the work. That's very important. And if your artistic work doesn't relate to everybody, and it's communicating to a very particular class of people, I really don't believe that's an artist's job. Artist's job is to go out there, position works of art, be responsible for that work of art, and try to communicate something so everybody can relate to it. It's like cooking. You want everyone to love your food. You don't want to serve your food only so particular people like it. You want everyone to enjoy it and kind of take something from it. It's like being an artist. You want people to relate to the work. I go to the artistic gallery scene, or you look at artistic works of art, and if they're only from white men, or generally you only have things that are potatoes and bread and it's white, that's a big problem. The audience needs to be exposed to a lot of different things, so you can kind of go, oh, I like this, I don't like this, I like this, you know, maybe this, not this. So, you know, that's incredibly problematic, and that's what people need to be thinking about, because if that's not a reflection of what's going on in the world, if the reflection, or if artistic work is only reflected upon by a particular social class and by a particular race, that is a little bit disrespectful for the audience, because the artist's work has to kind of reflect what's going on in reality. And if the only people that are communicating reality through an artistic white classist canon, that's not respect for the audience. The audience needs to kind of be exposed to a very wide variety of topics and experiences. It's like you can't expect people who go to a restaurant to just eat potatoes and bread. It just doesn't work like that. You want to have everything, even though it may not be your thing. You know, I don't want to eat escargot all the time, but I want to have the chance to like try it, you know? So I can say, oh, I like this, I don't like this. It's like, that's how I feel about it, you know? It's like, I don't want to eat white bread and potatoes, even though it might be grown on aristocratic land. I don't want to do that, you know, and I certainly don't want to give my audience or give the artistic audience, you know, only two possibilities. I think that's quite disrespectful, and I think it's a little bit, it's a bit boring. I don't want to eat all that stuff all the time. It's terrible.